Everyone thinks the Vikings survived the harsh winters of the frozen north because they were strong, because they were violent, because they were brutal. But here's the truth. The Vikings didn't survive winter because they were tough. They survived because they were disciplined and had a community that stood together. When most people talk about the greatest enemies of the North, they think of England, Francia, and the Saxons. But it wasn't any of the foes that resided to the south. It was winter. Winter was the cold-hearted villain and the greatest adversary of the Viking Age. And if you understand how they conquered the cold, you'll understand a lot more than that. You'll journey into their mindset, their motivations, and the lessons that transcend time. Winter was not just about weather in their world. It was a crucible, a judge, a quiet executioner that didn't swing a sword, and it starved its victims slowly. In this episode, we'll look at how the Vikings physically survived extended periods of darkness and cold, not with luck, not with the fury of a berserker, but with planning, discipline, and foresight. We'll explore how winter was a threat to the Viking Age, but also how it forged it. How the pressure of scarcity, isolation, and survival may have been the very force that pushed them south towards England, towards trade routes, toward expansion. We'll uncover the social systems that kept them from collapsing under the weight of winter. The community bonds, the shared responsibility, the unspoken rule that no one survives winter alone. And we'll see how surviving winter became a kind of proving ground, a training camp for raiders, traders, explorers, and kings. Winter made them harder, sharper, more willing to risk everything when the ice finally broke. And then we'll turn the question toward ourselves, because winter is more than a season that comes once a year. It comes in seasons of life too. Listen for the principles during the Viking Age. Listen to what they employed, not just to survive, but to leave their mark on history. You might even find that those principles have real value for you now, or the next time winter blankets your world. Winter didn't arrive with drama. It came quietly and politely. A chill in the air, frost on the ground, a thin layer of ice on water buckets. But the family, they knew this winter was going to be different. This was the first winter without their son. Their first winter where mother and daughter were going to have to bear the full weight of survival. Solveig was the last remaining child of a humble Norwegian couple who had worked the same plot of land their entire lives. With the exception of Solveig's father, Einar, who used to sow the field in the spring and then go on raids during the summer months. He had been to Denmark many times and to England on one occasion, where he was wounded terribly and lost the function of his right arm. Winter doesn't take notice of circumstances or whether or not one is just or unjust. It came in all the same, without feeling, without remorse. Solveig tended to the sheep who had begun to grow restless as they adapted to the changing of the season. She checked the hens and noticed fewer eggs than normal. The lack of sunlight was affecting them too. Every day the sun slipped over the tree line sooner than the last. Solveig took the last of the wool wares that they had woven last winter to the market, a blanket, 3 tunics, and a pair of mittens. She was hoping to trade them for some dried fish or cured meat. Solveig's family grew their own barley and had plenty of turnips to last the winter, or so they thought. But protein was in short supply. When she arrived at the first vendor, she quickly noticed that there was no deal to be had. Instead, she received the meanest scowl an old weathered face could give. She was taken back, frozen in her steps. She turned half a step to the next stall and received a quick look of disgust before an old hunchback woman turned her back on Solveig. Flashbacks to earlier that summer when her brother stood trial before the elders and the whole community. They flooded her mind. The pain of saying goodbye to the one that she cared so deeply about, her protector, her hero, it broke her right there where she stood all over again. The market, it was full of whispers. You should have left with him. The gods don't favor the kin of an outlaw. I wouldn't sell fish scales to them if they paid in pure silver. Solveig heard all of it. The hardest part were these people had been involved in their lives. These women had braided her hair, scolded her for taking too big of a mouthful from fresh bread baked in the market, and they gave her a little extra every time she came to the market to trade goods. But something had changed. Something dramatically had changed. And winter was about to mirror her brother's outlawry, cold, isolating, and merciless. Inside the longhouse, her mother counted stores again. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, sacks of barley stacked in the corner of their small house. The look on her mother's face suggested they had just enough to make it through the winter, to keep the sheep fed and then plant fresh crops in the spring. Einar said little. Most of the time he was distant. It had taken him many years to come to terms with his injury, but now losing his son created a wound deeper than any sword. Solveig returned home from the market with nothing to show for. She laid the folded blanket on the bench beside the hearth, with the mittens and the tunics that she had stitched by lamplight last winter. Work that once meant security now felt like a question with no answer. Her mother didn't scold her. She only nodded, slow and quiet, and went back to counting and calculating how long all of their food would last. Outside, the wind began to shift. It no longer brushed the walls, it pressed against them. That night, the first real snow came. Not a dusting, not a polite frost, but a heavy, wet, and relentless snow. By morning, the path to the well had vanished. The sheep huddled close in their pen, and the hens refused to leave the coop. Einar stood in the doorway, his useless arm hanging stiff at his side, watching the sky like a man who had once read the waves for danger, but now read the clouds and the expression on his wife's face instead. But it was her face that sent chills down his spine. She had the look of a ship captain that knew the approaching storm might very well sink the whole crew, ship and all. The next few weeks they were cold. In the darkness it lingered longer in the mornings, and it came too quick in the evening. Solveig could hear her parents speaking in hushed tones in the darkness when they thought that she was asleep. But how can you sleep when your stomach is empty? Her parents debated what they could do. Journey to the next village on foot, rob the neighbor's cellar for a few more turnips. They knew they didn't have enough to make it through the winter. Even if spring came early, it wouldn't be early enough. Einar, he had waited as long as he could. After several days without fresh snow, a narrow window opened, and he decided he would go. He rose before dawn without lighting the hearth. The home was dim, the embers were low. He dressed slowly, carefully, putting on an old cloak that he had worn in his younger years. He gathered the wool goods Solveig had tried to trade in the market, the blanket, the tunics, and the mittens, and he took an old valuable knife, one that had served him well on many battlefields, and he slid it into his belt. Solveig lay still, watching through half-closed eyes, and she heard him whisper to her mother. "I will go south," he said. "I'll see what I can trade, even the blade if I must." Her mother's voice broke in the darkness. "You won't make it." Einar didn't answer. When the door opened, the cold rushed in like a verdict. It filled the small house, sharp and final, reminding them all that doing nothing meant certain death. Solveig understood, but beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was something deeper stirring. The injustice of it. A community that had turned their back on an entire family because of the verdict of one man, because of her brother. An outlaw condemned too quickly, judged too harshly, and now spoken like a curse. Winter was not their only enemy. Silence was. Moments after her father disappeared into the gray dawn, Solveig rose. She dressed quickly, jaw set, and she slipped out the door without a word. Her mother watched her go. Solveig walked with purpose towards the village. It was still early. Smoke had not yet risen from most roofs. Frost lay untouched on the path. She stopped before the longhouse of the chieftain, the largest in the settlement. Inside slept the chieftain, his sons, their wives, and servants. What she didn't know was that another elder had joined them, whose roof had collapsed during the last heavy snow. She pounded on the door, kicked it, and she shouted until her voice was hoarse. The hall, it began to stir. Voices rose inside. And as the door latch began to lift, Solveig drew a breath and spoke the words that would either save her family or seal their fate as outcasts forever. We'll return to the story in a moment. But first, here's the part about Viking Age winter that most people get wrong. We love the image of Vikings surviving winter because they're hardcore, because they're fierce, and because they can fight bears. But winter doesn't care how tough you are. Winter kills the unprepared. And that's the secret. The Vikings didn't survive because they were brutal. They survived because they built systems. Winter survival started months before the first snow. In autumn, families had to make crucial decisions. They couldn't feed every animal through the winter, so they calculated. Some livestock were slaughtered, not because they wanted to, but because math demanded it. The meat was then salted, smoked, dried, or fermented. Fish would have been hung on wood racks and left to dry in the cold wind until they had turned hard. This would have been stockfish that could last for years. Barley was stored carefully in dry lofts. Turnips were buried and insulated in pits, or what we would call cellars. They didn't hope food would last. They counted it. They calculated. How many mouths, how many days, how many storms before spring? The answer to winter was arithmetic, and the Vikings, they were good at this type of math. Norse homes had to be built to endure harsh conditions. A Viking longhouse was not a drafty shack with a fire in the middle. It was engineered for survival. The roof was layered with thick turf or grass sod, sometimes even reaching only a few feet from the ground. This method was all about insulation against wind and snow, all the while keeping the heat from the fire in. The walls were heavy timber and packed earth. The hearth ran down the center, radiating heat throughout the home. If they had windows, which most did not, windows were small because heat was precious. And here's something modern people might find strange, but when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Sometimes animals were kept in the same home or hall where people slept. Not because it was nice to cuddle sheep or because they had pets. It was more about body heat to keep the home from freezing when the fire ran low. Every living thing inside that hall was part of the heating system. The longhouse, it might have looked primitive, but it was well thought out and it was planned to endure winter. And here's something Hollywood rarely shows, and we don't even consider in our modern world of isolation. A lone Viking did not survive winter. Winter demanded cooperation. Food was shared in times of need. If one family lost livestock, others stepped in. If you hoarded too much while your neighbor starved, winter would effectively destroy your reputation. Honor wasn't about swagger or confidence. It was about reliability and generosity. Winter required unity. Division and isolation meant starvation. And here's something to consider as a result. When you live like this every year, when you plan together, endure together, ration together, you become something stronger and tougher together. You become disciplined, exercise restraint, and care for your neighbor. So when the ice finally breaks, you become willing to risk everything knowing you survived the toughest foe of the North, and that you have a tribe that supports you, and that you are willing to sacrifice for them too. And that is how winter forged the Viking Age. Now here's where it gets interesting. It didn't weaken the North, it didn't weaken the Norse, it didn't weaken those that fought during the Viking Age. It was a selection process. Winter did exactly what battle does. It revealed character. Who was willing to stand? Who would run? Who would fold under the pressure? One saga portrays a strong hero who had been run out of town, dwelling on a remote island in Iceland, and he wasn't defeated by an army. He wasn't bested in a duel. He spent years in isolation, and what broke him wasn't the typical foe. It was the cold. It was the darkness. It was the loneliness. The saga makes it painfully clear. A man can survive a sword fight for a few minutes, a few hours, but winter would test him for months. On the other side of that equation, consider the Greenlanders, settlements and communities founded by Eric the Red. Norse communities that survived for centuries in some of the harshest climates imaginable, but only because the combined discipline and effort of everyone doing their part for the good of the whole. Winter doesn't care about bravado or bravery. It does, however, expose planning, unity, and character. And if you survived it, You would come out sharper, stronger, and more ready for whatever was next. Here's a fascinating twist to the Norse winter. It was built into Norse cosmology as well. It wasn't just seasonal, it was cosmic. There's something called the Fimbul winter, or the Great Winter. According to the Poetic Edda, this terrible winter comes right before Ragnarok, right before the end of the world. 3 winters, back to back to back. No summer between them. Civilization collapses. Brothers fight brothers. The world fractures. For the common Norse farmer, this wasn't abstract theology. This hit close to home. Imagine living in a land where winter already feels like it lasts most of the year, and your sacred stories say that one day it simply will not go away. Every long winter carried an echo of that myth. Winter wasn't just weather. It was a rehearsal, and it was baked into the Norse idea of fate and embracing what was inevitable. And winter, to the north, was just that, inevitable. And here's one more historical reality that might just shed some light on the impact winter had on the Viking Age. When Vikings first raided the coasts of France, especially along the Seine, sometimes they stayed a little bit longer than expected, and they discovered something shocking. The winters in France were much more mild. The rivers, they didn't freeze as brutally. Fall lasted longer, the sun never disappeared for days or weeks at a time. Food was more plentiful. They also noticed that trade was plentiful even in the winter months. Word traveled. Many Vikings came for plunder, many more stayed for the climate. If winter is your greatest enemy at home, and you discover a land where winter is softer and the fields are generous, you don't just raid it, you consider making it your home. And that's exactly what happened. The Viking Age wasn't just about conquest, it had a lot to do with migration. Winter didn't just forge warriors and raiders, it pushed expansion. And all that tells us that winter wasn't just something the Vikings endured. It was a force that shaped their psychology, their cosmology, their politics, and even their geography. We've also learned that winter is not something that you survived alone in the north, which is why the stakes are so high for Solveig and her family. It's not even midwinter, and her family is desperate. Her father left to make a trek that no one would dare make under any other circumstance. And now we return to Solveig, standing outside the chieftain's longhouse, ready to say what only she can. You banished an innocent man, and now your selfishness has condemned an entire family to die of hunger. You sent my brother away with cruel words, and now with no words you've sentenced my father to the same fate. He's just trying to save his family while your family has everything they need, and your dead son... And the door opened just before she could finish that last sentence. Warmth spilled from the door. The chieftain, gray-bearded and stern, his eldest son, watched from inside. Another elder, wrapped in heavy cloaks, emerged to witness the following conversation. They had heard every word. The chieftain stepped forward slowly. He stood in the threshold. His eyes did not burn with anger. They were calm and measured. Your brother killed my son, and your family deserves whatever the winter brings. My brother was banished because he chose to protect me from your son, and you all refuse to consider anything other than ridding yourselves of the reminder of your son's debauchery and lewdness. That's enough. You and your family can die alone, and spring will celebrate being rid of you all. And with that, the door slammed shut, not in rage, in dismissal. Solveig stood there for a moment, staring at the wood grain as if it might crack open again, but it didn't. The chieftain had answered her in the coldest way possible. Indifference. She turned and walked home, with frost biting her cheeks and something heavier still settling in her chest. All that remained now was hope, fragile, thin, resting on whether her father would return with anything that could save them. The problem was this: they would not know for a week. A week in winter doesn't feel like 7 days, it feels like a month. A week passed. Einar didn't return. Even with just 2 mouths to feed, the stores were shrinking fast. The barley sack grew light, the turnip pile grew smaller. Hunger sharpened the edges of every thought. 2 more weeks passed. By now, hope had thinned to the last turnip and a few scattered kernels of barley at the bottom of the sack. That is when the basket appeared. It sat quietly at the door one morning. No knock, no voice, just a woven basket lined with cloth. Inside were dried fish, a small sack of grain, and a wedge of hard cheese. Solveig and her mother stood staring at it, like it might vanish. They didn't know what to think. And then, 2 days later, another basket came, this time with a cured leg of lamb, heavy and rich with salt and smoke. Then, once a week for the remainder of the winter, baskets appeared, sometimes with bread, sometimes with root vegetables, one time even with a little honey. And there was never a name or an explanation, just provision, just a community helping those in need without the need for recognition, or maybe without wanting to draw the ire of the chieftain. With hope restored, the women returned to winter work. The loom creaked again, the wool began to spin, blankets, tunics, mittens. They were making them not just to survive, but to be prepared. Because before winter was over, they were already thinking about how to be prepared for the next winter, especially if Einar failed to return. As the winter tipped toward spring, they began speaking of a journey south when the thaw came, to learn what had become of Einar, and to trade the goods that they had made. If their village would not welcome them back fully, perhaps another would. Winter had brought them to the brink, but it didn't break them, because someone or a few someones proved that community in the north was the key to survival. And as the days slowly lengthened and the light lingered a little longer each evening, Solveig thought about the lesson winter had taught her. Winter does not merely test your ability to prepare. It reveals what kind of person you are, and it reveals who your true community really is. And so let's talk about these lessons for a moment, because winter isn't just snow, cold, and long nights. It can also be a season where we have to weather, navigate, and endure financial strain, relationship stress, work fatigue, creative drought, loneliness, the blights of depression. And when it comes, we all want spring to come immediately. We want relief. We want rescue. We want the situation to thaw. But the Norse were realists. They anticipated winter. They structured their lives around the certainty that hardship would come. That's the first step. Knowing that tough times come means being ready. Putting things in order while the sun is shining and not waiting until things take a turn. Think about what they did in Scandinavia. They stored before things were scarce. They strengthened bonds in the community before the isolation that winter brings began. They practiced discipline, moderation, and they calculated their needs for more than just today. So the question isn't whether winter will come, it's whether you'll be ready to endure it. 3 quick thoughts from this episode. Preparation doesn't get applause, but it does mean survival. Shared burdens weigh a lot less. People crack under pressure when they stand alone. And sometimes the coldest seasons in life are what lead us to explore and expand our horizons and settle in some place much warmer and more abundant that we would never have journeyed before without the cold of winter. The North didn't survive because it was lucky. It survived because it was prepared. And so if this episode stirred something in you, then think about your community and share it. Share this episode with someone who makes you stronger. And if you're looking for a community, Viking Legacy and Lore exists on Discord and is looking for people like you to create a like-minded group to share more stories and develop a community for whatever comes our way. Until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.